Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Youth Rights Podcast. Today we're here with me, your host, Zane, aka Zillion. Y'all know me from the last two podcast episodes, and I have been making podcast appearances on other related shows, talking about youth rights. I am now officially on the NYRA Board of Directors. So that's it for me. Today we're going to be talking with Nick Tabor, who is a youth rights YouTuber. He speaks out on issues like authoritarianism in schools, coercive mental health treatments, and the troubled teen industry. I'm going to go ahead and give Ian and Rosa time to introduce themselves because they have not been in an episode before, and they're just going to let them introduce themselves, and then we're going to let Nick introduce himself, and he's going to talk about his videos and everything, and the work he does for youth rights, and then we'll just go into the issues from there. So, Ian and Rosa, y'all can go first.
My name is Rosa, and I'm currently a junior in high school. I go to school at Ridge High School, and it's in New Jersey.
I'm Ian Golec, and I've just kind of always cared about getting students to be able to have more input into their schooling, and joined NYRA, and just recently came across Nick's website and invited him to come on our podcast.
Okay. Well, Nick, you can go ahead and introduce yourself, talk about your videos, talk about everything you do, talk about the issues that are most important to you for youth rights, and we'll just kind of let you go for a while.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. I've really admired the National Youth Rights Association for a long time. I think what you guys are doing is super important. If if I had been allowed to do something like this when I were a teenager, I would have, but I was being oppressed, so I couldn't. But in terms of, I'll just talk a little bit about my story. What brought me to this was I was diagnosed when I was a kid with a number of psychiatric disorders and was heavily pathologized and was said to have behavior problems and things like this. But what was really going on for me was I was kind of a more sensitive kid. I had a lot of passion, a lot of energy. I was kind of intense. And more than anything, I really valued my own self determination and freedom. And so, because of all of that, I was really at odds with my environment because it didn't tolerate those aspects of myself and of kids in general. And so it was that conflict that led me, that kind of created a lot of distress for me. And, in some ways I wasn't behaving great. And so there's a lot of conflict there. And I was always interested in things that reflected this, that reflected these aspects of myself, right? In kind of like anti-authoritarian philosophy, in personal development and spirituality that were outside of organized religion and the mental health system, and things of that nature. And I always had a sense that a lot of what we're calling mental illness in children is really due to how we marginalize them. And I think this marginalization of children is something that most people don't even really have a concept of, let alone take seriously. That's kind of my view of it, in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
And so eventually I got more rebellious, and things started to really escalate when I was a teenager, and that's when I was sent to the troubled teen industry, which I think you guys are aware of. I saw some written on the National Youth Rights Association website. And when I was there, I was heavily brainwashed and coerced and forced to really abandon my perspective and kind of stripped of any sense of my own identity and authentic self, which is a really common theme at these kind of programs. And they really do wipe the slate clean of who you are. And then when I got out, when I was a young adult, I was maintaining the appearances you're supposed to. I was doing the things that were expected of me, but I wasn't happy because the oppressed teenager within me, you could say, really hadn't been liberated at that point. And meanwhile, I saw most of my friends who I was at these programs with doing really poorly, right? Having serious addiction issues, and many of them seeming, quite frankly, to die left and right, often due to suicide. And as my 20s came to a close, I was like maybe 28 or 29, I started to really figure out the truth, which is that we were really mistreated. We had Stockholm syndrome, in my opinion, toward the people who supposedly helped us. We were seriously psychologically abused at these programs, and that's much of why we were suffering. And um, and around then was when I really figured out how to really heal from all of these things. And I also discovered thinkers. I don't know if you guys are familiar with these people, but people like Alice Miller, John Holt, John Taylor Gatto, people like this that really kind of validated my true perspective around all of these things. And so now I'm really passionate about helping people who were pathologized when they were kids in these kind of authoritarian settings, help them to understand it all, integrate it, heal, and as I would put it, kind of recover their latent potential and sort of power that gets robbed of them through these dynamics. And so I create YouTube videos around these things. I've been writing a lot on Twitter/X. I was recently at the Future of Mental Health in America conference talking about some of these things and bringing sort of a youth rights perspective to that. So yes, that's kind of a long-winded introduction.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you want to talk about like how specifically people can heal from these situations?
Yeah, absolutely. I can talk about that. I'm also happy if you want to like talk about some more of the other dynamics too. But yeah, we can go through this in like any direction you want.
Okay.
In terms of healing, I think that I really think that I really believe in like a self-directed approach to healing.
Mm-hmm.
Because what everyone needs is really unique, and for me, a lot of it was like I wasn't really ready to do it until I was maybe again in my late 20s to early 30s. Because there's so much pain that is involved in all of these things, right? And I think like as a species, we're coming from a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, and so for me, a lot of it had to do with kind of getting centered into my own body again, right? Doing a lot of meditation. And then from there, I could find some of the different resources that were helpful for that, and I think that's a really good way to approach it.
Okay. Do you want to talk about those other dynamics that you said you wanted to go into?
Yeah, totally, totally. I mean, I thought about this a little bit, because like I think you talked about, we could talk about some of the things like authoritarianism in school, coercive mental health treatment, troubled teen industry. So I kind of thought about some of these things. But yeah, no, please feel free to stop me anytime and go into any direction you'd like to. But I know that like authoritarianism in school is a big theme for you guys, I think, and that's something that I think a lot about because I think that is a place where a lot of people are wounded. A lot of people are hurt in school, and one could certainly argue that conventional modern schooling is inherently wounding. And so that's something I've thought a lot about. And I think like just the recognition that the school system is fundamentally authoritarian and that there are consequences of this is a big paradigm shift. And it's not something that's widely acknowledged. Um, there's this is something I know you guys have written on your website, right? There's a lot of like non-consensual evaluation. That's kind of like most of what seems to happen to me. A lot, our behavior, the required behavior of us is dictated. We have to display the attitudes that are expected of us. We're not given meaningful choice in what we study and do. And all of this is under the threat of really serious punishment, legal consequences in some cases. And I think it's really, very much at odds with our developmental needs, which involve being centered in our own bodies, right? It destroys our connection to, you could say, like our inner compass or our inner wisdom, or however you want to look at that. And so, as far as I can tell, a lot of what is happening in conventional school is like the population is being robbed of a kind of sovereign personal destiny in childhood. And the ones who are feeling this more acutely, the kids, are being pathologized. And I think a lot of what we're calling mental health problems in kids really comes down to this, which is that it's resisted. We pathologize them. We say that they have behavior problems. Kids suffer emotionally because of it, and we say that they have a mental illness. and now increasingly, I think with things like so-called social emotional learning, which is really widespread now, we try to kind of attune to their emotions, while not actually recognizing that suffering is a very normal reaction to a situation that is oppressive and bad for us. Um, but it's like you're supposed to have a strong negative reaction to having your life be so comprehensively processed by an authoritarian system, and you're not supposed to just acquiesce to that. That's my opinion. And so, like, just one final thought on this, and then I'm totally curious about your guys' input. I think, like, looking at the big picture here, something that I've come to realize lately is that, like, in history, right, as a species, we progressively moved past various forms of what you could call dominator culture, right? And I think, like, you could call this progress, right? Whether it's rejecting the rule of kings during the Enlightenment, or rejecting male domination of women, or slavery, things like this, right? But modern schooling and the treatment of children in general, I think, is a huge remaining piece of this dominator culture. And there have been people that have recognized this about modern schooling since its inception during the Industrial Revolution. But we're still operating under a kind of spell. And I think we have a kind of Stockholm syndrome toward it. And I think a lot of that has to do with our own remaining wounds, right, as people.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you for the school system, especially because of the way that it's so authoritarian. Especially recently, I think a lot of states have passed like phone bans and stuff like that, a way to like take people's property, which, I feel like one of the biggest violations of youth rights is the fact that kids don't have the right to their own property. Like they can go out and buy something with their own money, and then like a school person or like their parent can take it from them, and then, that's it. Like they don't have access to that property. They don't have the legal right to it. I mean, especially in schools when they need those types of things for safety. I definitely feel like that kind of like safety is being robbed from them. That's just one example. I know, Rosa, you're still in high school. Do you feel like you see a lot of these like authoritarian trends that you was discussing in your own school?
Yeah, my school actually passed the phone ban just like last year, but I think the thing is most of us like we were angry, kind of like mad and frustrated in the beginning that we don't get to use our phones. But then I feel like since the ban applied to everyone, we kind of just realized, hey, our friends can't use our phones either. Our teachers also can't use our phones. So I feel like over time we kind of just got used to it and we just ended up accepting the fact that we don't have our phones.
Mm-hmm. Are you concerned at all for like if there's like a safety issue, like something that maybe you would need your phone for? Do you feel like that's concerning, or what do you think about that?
I'm not sure because my district, like, usually we have things like called intruder drills. So, like, if someone comes in, you'll have a drill and everyone just goes into the back of the room. At
Mm-hmm.
that point, our school does allow us to, like, take out our phones just in case we want to, like, call a parent or things
Mm-hmm.
like that. But regularly, we don't get to use our phones. I don't think it has been just a huge safety issue for me, but I feel like you now can't communicate with your friends like during class. Like, we're forced to rely on things like email. Our school also blocked, like, Google Chat because they found some like inappropriate messages on them. So I kind of think this also ties into this idea of authoritarianism because like one person did something bad and now this entire Google platform is just banned for all our students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely agree on that.
Yeah, a lot of the talk about with like phones and in schools and things like that is it's being done in the name of mental health, and that's kind of perceived as a good thing. So if you argue against it, you're seen as like being against healthcare, and that makes you evil. Um, but from what you're saying, it's kind of doing the opposite, and it also doesn't make a whole lot of sense for why state laws are being passed to ban phones because most schools already have policies to like regulate phones use in class. So it's kind of when they talk about like statewide phone bans, it's more like performative to kind of deflect attention from some of the oppression and just kind of blame it on that your problems are because your phones are causing mental health problems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I also think like the lack of student input is like really apparent in like my district and our surrounding district. So basically for us, we have this like website. It's called Genesis. It's where you can like check all of your grades. And my freshman year of high school, you were able to open this website at any time and just check your grades. But then our school said it made us too stressed. So they actually blocked us from checking our grades during the day. You can only check your grades after 3 p.m. when you're
Wow.
off from school. And I think this actually had the opposite effect in my school. Now everyone's super stressed. And you can see the moment like the final bell rings in school, everyone's going on their phone immediately to check their grades. So I think that they just delayed the stress instead of actually trying to mitigate it.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of a common trend with they're like, oh, let's do something that they act like they're helping, but realistically everything they do to help is just it's not actually fixing the source of the problems. Like if the kids are stressed about their grades, maybe it's because of the system and the way the school is being run. It's not like, oh, let's just stop them from checking it. Like that would be like a bank saying, let's just stop you from seeing how much money is in your account because oh, what if it stresses you out? So yeah, and that's yeah, the schools definitely do a lot of weird things like that, which is kind of deflecting from the real problem of the fact that the authoritarianism within the school is a lot of the times what contributes to the decreasing mental health of the students. And Nick, you said you want to go into some more stuff about mental health. If you want to go into that, you can.
Yeah, and I just had a quick thought on what you guys are saying. Like, it's a lot of doing things to students rather than working with them. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like those are really this is something that Alfie Kohn talks about. He's a really great thinker. It's like doing to approaches versus working with. And one could argue that doing to approaches are inherently dehumanizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think people tend to respond better and feel a lot better when there's like working with approaches. Yeah, when it comes to mental health, I mean, I think like we're kind of touching on it where it's like um, they have all these ideas. There's all these ideas that are out about like what's going on with our mental health and what we need. And again, it's often when we're kids, it's not from this place of really listening to us and understanding us and taking us seriously. It's from this place of like they have these ideas, and then we're just going to do these things to you. And I think that one kind of really important dynamic here that I think is still very prevalent, and it was certainly what I experienced, a lot of people experience, which is that like a lot of the older forms of coercion of kids have fallen somewhat out of fashion. So things like, I hope it's okay to say this here, but things like physical, like hitting children, things like this. Um, they're not as hip today, but the motivations behind them haven't necessarily gone away, right? So
Mm-hmm.
in order for the deeper motivations behind those things to go away, the adults would actually need to like do some pretty profound inner work on themselves, I think. Right, it's like we still want kids to do what we want them to do, and we want them to do it. We want them to think the way that we do in many cases. We want them to like act in a way that feels good to our fragile egos. And when they're not obeying us, we might say like, oh, we're really concerned for their mental health and things are really hard for them. And then often they're taken to a psychiatrist who provides medications. And what do the medications do in many cases? They blunt kids' feelings, right? And not just kids, adults too. They blunt emotions. And it's their strong feelings that they're not willing to dissociate from that are driving their strong wills and sometimes their resistance and their rebelliousness and their sense of self. And so in that sense, mental health services can really just be new forms of coercion. And I'm not saying that this is what's happening in every case, but I think this is what is happening a lot of the time. And so it's like we're not changing the deeper authoritarian paradigm. We're just changing the veneer to look more humane, and we're changing some of the mechanics. Like we're acting in a more genteel way so that we feel better about ourselves. So I think that's kind of one of the dynamics when it comes to mental health treatment of kids. But it's certainly a complicated topic.
So would you think that mental health professionals in general kind of like overdiagnose these issues as an excuse to like control kids or like an excuse to make them work in certain ways? Would that be something you would say?
There's a strong case to be made for that. Yeah, a lot of people have talked about overdiagnosis, right? Like the staggering numbers of kids diagnosed with ADHD. It's like the percentage is shocking, and I think there's certainly a case to be made that that's happening. Like like all of the kids, right, who have needs that are not being met by the school system. We just, it's easy to kind of put a psychiatric label on them and then diagnose them. But it's not just in the school system; it's also in family systems, right, where there's a lot of unresolved issues. There's emotional neglect. Maybe there's different kinds of abuse going on, and the families don't want to deal with it. And so they can take a kid to the mental health professional. And I think, this was my experience very often. Mental health professionals will just give the parents basically what they want, which is different forms of control. And medications can act that way heavily, right? Also, therapy can act that way for kids too. And certainly things like the troubled teen industry, residential mental health treatment, behavior modification, all these kinds of things can be tools for that.
Okay, yeah, I definitely see what you're saying there, and I would probably agree, for the most part, especially like when kids act in a way that isn't like conducive to how the school system operates, like they kind of get labeled in a way where they need like a treatment or something. Like for example, like ADHD is such a big thing that kids get labeled with. And one of the symptoms of that is just like, being restless, not wanting to sit down for long periods of time. So it's basically, and then, that's kind of how school operates. Like, it wants you to just sit down, just like work on this like thing or whatever for long periods of time. And it's like, some people that works really well with them and they can do that. But like, other people, they're more restless. Like they don't want to just like sit for long periods of time and just like put pencil to paper, read a book. Like they want to just like be out and like moving and doing things. And, I feel like a lot of the time that's not necessarily a symptom of them having a brain disorder. I feel like that's a symptom of just, different people work in different ways and they have different needs and like, that kind of works differently for them. So I would say, kind of in the examples that you're bringing up with how in certain cases, like psychiatry and diagnosis could be used to give extra control. Like I feel like if the parents are just too lazy to deal with, or the school system's too lazy to deal with like the kids' individual needs as individuals, and they just want to put everyone in a box. If everyone has to do this one thing, then they can kind of use diagnoses to sort of like try to mitigate that problem instead of actually trying to help the kids themselves.
Exactly. It's a way of like managing the situation in many cases, rather than really like looking at the deeper problems. And sometimes, a lot of adults can find that very threatening, right?
Mhm.
Like, asking big questions about the school system, right? Why it looks the way that it does, how it's actually affecting kids, or looking at family systems, these are big issues. These are profound issues, and often it's just challenging for people to look at that. It's easier to be like, well, whoever points out the problem becomes the problem, and like if this doesn't work for you, there's something wrong with you.
Mhm.
And I think that's a lot of what's happening. But I'm
Yeah.
totally, because I mean, if you guys disagree, I'm very interested in different perspectives on this, because there are, there is so much variation here. I mean, I think that there are some kids where it's like maybe they really want to succeed in that system and they struggle to, and maybe can find a diagnosis helpful and they can find medication helpful. So there's a lot of variation here.
Mhm.
Yeah, I had a question. So obviously, as students, we probably can't go to school like one day and just like change the entire education system and tell all the administrators, hey, you're doing this wrong, you're doing that wrong. So in a scenario where like an individual is feeling like really isolated and really marginalized by their school and they feel like they're lacking their own identity, what would you suggest them do? Like, would this look like, I don't know, going outside of school and finding like other hobbies that are not offered in school? Or like, what does this kind of look like?
That's a really great question, and the problem is, I don't have a good answer to it, because I think that our ability to do something about these things really comes down to how much agency we have. And the problem is, kids don't have a lot of agency. They're not given a lot of agency, and so because I often get asked this question. It's like, what advice do you have for the kids in these situations? My advice goes to these people once they become adults, right? Like once you turn 18 and they have more power, because I think that's when we have more agency. That's when we can heal. That's when we can address these things in ourselves. And I think it's not too late to do that. And it's also to the adults, right? Because the adults do have, even though they are operating within systems as well, they have more of an ability to kind of do these things. But you're right. We don't like we're just in that system, right? And we're kind of powerless to it to a large extent. And it's the reality.
Hello, everyone. This is Zane in editing, and I do want to say that this section does kind of sound a bit doomery, and it makes it sound like there's not many things that young people can do to resist this kind of authoritarianism in their lives. But I do want to say that you can join a NIRA node and volunteer with the National Youth Rights Association, and we are advocating every day against this type of authoritarianism and systematic discrimination that young people face in their lives.
Yeah, so one thing I've kind of pointed out is when like students that are in schools, and how you're saying how some students might want to succeed in that system and others might want to leave, and how these psychiatric diagnoses are kind of being used to sort of pit students against each other. Because, for example, you might get a diagnosis, and you're denied the opportunity to take advanced classes, for example, because you're assumed to have a disability that makes you incapable of it. While at the same time, there might be students who are trying to leave school. Like, I knew somebody who was able to leave school early to get a job at a grocery store, but that benefit was contingent. It was meant to be for students with disabilities. So there's kind of a conflict of interest where, some students want to get rid of their diagnosis, and some of them want to, some of them want to use it to get the benefits, and have been kind of incentivized to seek them out themselves. So it's a way of, making them fight each other, basically.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, a lot of people will push back against kind of the argument that I'm making and say, like, well, these diagnoses are really important for people to get certain accommodations that they need, and it's like, nobody would want to kind of if somebody really wants that and feels they need that, nobody would want to get that taken away. And that's why I always like put that caveat in there, is like, it's not a one size fits all thing. But so, yeah.
Yeah, and there's something I wanted to touch on that you said earlier about how this isn't just a thing in schools. This is also an issue in family systems as well. And I feel like that is a very important thing that people discuss even less. And you mentioned how, like, they're not, like, families aren't, like, in a general sense, aren't, like, hitting kids as much or something, but they still. So, like, I've seen videos and stuff of punishments that parents do where it's like, oh, their kid snuck out, but instead of, like, beating their kid or something as a punishment, they'll do something else, do something weird where it's like, oh, they take the door off the room, or they'll smash. I've seen a video where, like, a dad, like, smashed his daughter's TV or something over that. So then it's like, okay, you're not hitting the kid, but it's like you're still acting in a controlling, authoritarian way that even though it may not have negative physical effects on the child, it's still going to have negative emotional effects, negative mental effects. And I feel like a lot of the times in these situations, the parent feels like, oh, well, I'm not hitting the kid, so I'm doing well. But it's like, I feel like the issue is they're not addressing the actual concern. Instead of sitting down with their kid and having, like, a conversation with them, being like, this is why, this is, like, why did you do this? Like, why did you feel the need to do this? Like, how can we, like, kind of mitigate this problem? Instead of, like, actually trying to, like, communicate with their teenager as, like, a young adult, they treat him as, like, someone who they have control over. So, like, we're just going to do all these weird authoritarian things. And I feel like that still has a negative effect on the child and makes them feel like they're in an authoritarian system where they can't really have the same agency that they would have otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. I really think you hit the nail on the head there, because it's like, it's again a doing to approach, right? Rather than a working with approach. And this is kind of why I touched on dominator culture. It's like that underlying paradigm is still there. We're just kind of shifting how we deal with it. And I think, there's this huge parenting industry, right? So many books about parenting and all of that. And most of them they're still fundamentally about, like, how can I get my kids to do what I want? And it's still fundamentally from that same place. And it's a whole different thing when, you treat them as fully human, or you try to do that, right? You humanize them. And yeah, if you're just like, I think that if you're just continuing to do different things that are about fundamentally manipulating them it's going to hurt them. It hurts them psychologically. It hurts them emotionally. It hurts their like long-term creativity. It's destructive. Um, and so like it kind of, I mean, it's hard to say like if some of these different interventions are worse than the other, but I think at the end of the day, like you say, it's like there's a different kind of paradigm that's needed, moving away from just the fundamental authoritarianism. So, and last thing I'll say is like when it comes to mental health issues, um, it's the emotional wounds that are created by these dynamics that are often what we're diagnosing as, oh yeah, this kid has problems, this kid has this disorder or that disorder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would agree with that, especially for the mental health things, because it's like, oh, this kid has a problem, let's put them on medication. But a lot of the times, what I've seen from people that I've known and from like experiences that I've had is the issues with the mental health oftentimes stem from an external factor within their life. And a lot of the times, those external factors is within their family. So it's like if they're growing up in an abusive home, maybe not physically abusive, but maybe like it's like they don't feel safe, they don't feel comfortable, like their parents are get angry, very hostile towards them, very controlling. It makes them have these emotional problems. So then the parents like, oh, let's take them to the psychiatrist and get them diagnosed with something. Let's put them on medication. Let's put them on antidepressants, whatever. That will fix the problem. But realistically, it's not. It's just numbing them, and it's not fixing the external factor, which is contributing to their poor mental health. And I feel like more mental health treatment should be focusing on what are the external factors that is leading you to feel this way. And with some people, it's fully in their head, and it's just like the way their brain chemistry works, and they need medication. That's obviously like if that's what they need, of course. But within a lot of circumstances, it's based on these external factors, and especially with children, so much of their life is dictated by these authoritarian things, like the way their parents control them, the way the school controls them. So I feel like a lot of the time they should take away the focus of how can we medicate this kid to fix their problems, and then focus on what are the external factors happening to them and how can we fix those problems.
Exactly. And this is why there is a rare minority of mental health professionals who say like I'm not going to see the kid because they're just responding to the environment that they're in. Maybe I'll talk to the parents, but in many cases the parents, they don't want that, right? They're like, "Oh no, my kid has the problem, fix the kid," And and so it's like, it's interesting because it's like what do you learn when you're just taken to a mental health professional to to kind of like have your emotions numbed with medication or something like that? Like what do you learn? You learn not to listen to your feelings, right? You learn not to like you become disconnected from your body. And I think like that's extremely damaging and that has major consequences. So yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this. There's a lot of threads we could go down, but
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you on that point that I feel like it's kind of just teaching them that they're feeling. I mean, it's not necessary. Like a lot of times, I mean, they'll go into like coping mechanisms for certain things that have happened in their life, but it's like realistically, if you're not fixing the source of the problem, you're just like teaching them how to deal with it. But a lot of times, the source of the problem relates to something going on in their home life. So it's like I feel like fixing that should be like I feel like it should be more normalized for therapists to get like the parents in there and to be like, hey, this is what you're doing. This is how it's a problem. This is what you need to stop it. Because like I feel like there's a lot of people that I know who've had problems relating to their parents, and they've had to go. Their parents have put them in therapy over it, but without realizing that they themselves were the source of the problem. So then the therapy was just completely useless because the kid didn't have a problem. Their problem was relating to the circumstances that were out of their own control.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I kind of think a point that um that Nick made that was interesting before was how like authoritarianism or like domination looked different in the past than in the present. So in the past, it was like characterized by like things like physical violence. So when I'm thinking about like parents or like older people, I'm thinking that the authoritarianism they experienced was probably going to be like these violence or like these different forms. So they just perceive like this domination and this authoritarianism as okay, and the way they treat their kids now it's not physical violence, so they think of themselves as a good person because now the authoritarianism today is like a different form from what they experienced back then.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. I think it's something I've thought a bit about is like what the internal experience of the adults is like, and because I think that's kind of the source of all of this, like like when kids are behaving in a way that, like, often kids are behaving in ways that make adults uncomfortable, make adults angry. And if you and but I think often these adults, and this is really common in the culture, there isn't good awareness around these internal states, right? There's not good awareness around these feelings and things like that. And they haven't spent a lot of time integrating all of that. And so it's like when you spend years of your life, integrating all of your anger, all of your insecurity, all of these things, the way you show up to other people is very, very different. And I think that is often what kids are responding to. They're responding to, the kind of energy that the adults are bringing. And it's when you have cultivated that, like I think it's fair to say that you can rely so much less on coercion in order to sort of have good relationships with kids, in order to kind of give them what they need. But this is something that is really poorly understood. And one of the other things I was going to say was, in the whole critical mental health field, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but it's related to our discussion, that they really point out everything that you were saying, Zane, which is that, like, in many cases the problem is with the environment, and people are just responding to that, and not just with kids but with adults too, right? There's all these issues in our environment, in our lives, we're dealing with, and then we go to a mental health professional, and very often, probably more often than not, maybe you're told that you have a chemical imbalance if you see a psychiatrist, it's not like that's from a biological test. It's not like that's from a test. They haven't done a brain scan or a blood test saying that you have a chemical imbalance. It's like, no, they're just speculating. That's just the idea they get from their profession. Often we're being distracted from the real things that we're facing. And I think very often, yeah, with kids, it's the school system that's really authoritarian, and that's really damaging, right? It's in these family systems, which can also be authoritarian, or where there's like emotional neglect and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the critical mental health authors. I wrote an article that we're trying to get published soon. References work of Dr. Sami Tamimi. One of his main points is that when we talk about giving someone a diagnosis in mental health, diagnosis conventionally means it's an explanation of the cause of something, which, like, diabetes means that your problems are caused by high blood sugar. But when you talk about diagnosis in mental health, you haven't actually identified the cause. You're just describing what they're calling symptoms, which are just experiences that someone is having. So to think of it as a diagnosis, it's like, the analogy he uses is that it's like saying the pain in your head is caused by a headache. So it's ignoring all of the context that's going on in someone's life.
And it's uncomfortable to look at. I think that people find it difficult to look at those things, right? Like, if you're a educator and you've dedicated your life to working in that system, maybe you have a bunch of student loans that you've taken out through it. You don't want to look and think like, well, I'm working for a system that is not great in a lot of ways, right? Or if you're a parent, maybe you don't want to look at what's really going on in your family, and the sources in yourself that are driving that. But at the end of the day, that's where the potential for actually, like, improving the human condition is when we look at upgrading these environments. And of course that's going to be difficult.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like a lot of it kind of goes into the fact that people within these positions have a critical lack of self-awareness. Like, they don't realize that they're the ones in power and they're contributing to these problems. Like, I had a friend once who had like a very, very controlling, narcissistic, abusive mother. And when obviously my friend, her mental health was suffering directly because of that, there was nothing else going on in her life to contribute to that. It was like, she's like, oh, let me just put her, you need to go to therapy now or something. And then she went to therapy, and that had no help for her. It did absolutely nothing because the therapist didn't call in the mom and be like, "Hey, you're causing these problems." They just like, tried to help my friend like cope with it on her own, but like that doesn't really fix the actual external cause of the problems. And it's really upsetting of the fact that so many kids have to deal with these, either parents who are controlling, manipulative, narcissistic, sometimes even abusive. And the school system, that's the same way. It doesn't take their concerns into the matter. It doesn't, instead of going with like, how are we going to work, like what you were saying with how are we going to work with them to fix the problem and like make things better for them, it's like everyone else besides the actual person who it affects like making these decisions, like for school, like school boards, for example. Like, kids don't have the right to vote. They can't vote for who's on those school boards. Parents are the ones voting, but parents aren't the ones like who are actually responsible or who actually like are within the system, so they don't really know what it needs. They just think they know what it needs. So then they can vote for who's on the school board, and the school board makes the decisions without the input of the students. So then realistically, it doesn't get better for the students. It's just they put in there what they think they need instead of working with them to actually figuring out what would help them.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's really, everything you're saying really resonates with me. It's it's interesting when you read people that have an alternative perspective to this, and because there's a lot of like alternative education models out there that work pretty well, right? They're not perfect, but there's like these different models out there that have been around for a long time, and it really goes to show that like we don't need to take any of this for granted. The things that aren't working well, like we don't have to take them for granted. There's a great book, Free to Learn by Peter Gray, where he talks about, he's a evolutionary psychologist, and he talks about some of these alternative education models where, like, for example, kids vote in that school. Kids are treated as like equal members of that community. So it's just fascinating realizing that.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes, some of the people who are really like kind of defending the status quo or like advocating for the sending people to the troubled teen industry or of increasing the schooling requirements, for example, are people who have been through that themselves during their childhood and have, as you said, are kind of invested in that, and so they kind of see it as maybe like unfair that other people might not have to suffer the way they did, and instead of making it better for everyone, they kind of they feel like everybody else should have to do it too, and that's kind of one of the difficulties that comes with fighting for youth rights, like for school boards, because those are the people who end up on the boards or voting for them.
Yeah, just that this issue of like the fact that that like going through these things as kids, right? It conditions us, and so that's how these cycles get perpetuated. I think that's how I see it.
Mm-hmm.
And so adults, right? Teachers, educators, parents, like they haven't necessarily dealt with that themselves, and I think like that's the source of this paradigm, and that's the sort of this authoritarianism that is continuing, and it's just people don't necessarily even know that this is something that they can deal with so that they can show up in a way that's more effective with their kids. But I think like that has a lot to do with how we create a kind of regime of childhood that is more humane and something that is worthy of being part of a sort of more consensual, partnership oriented culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm gonna say like, there's things that I've seen before. Like there was a video, for example, of a kid getting beat by his parent like very very badly, and then I've looked at the comments, and a lot of the comments were like, "Oh, I experienced so much. Well, this is nothing. I experienced so much worse when I was a kid," and then they're using their own suffering that they experienced as a justification to continuing on the cycle of suffering to other people. So I would kind of say that that's an example what you mean, but we're almost at an hour. We're probably gonna finish up real quick. Is there anything like you want to like last thoughts? Do you want to like plug? Do you want to talk about like your YouTube channel, your Twitter, anything like that?
Yeah, I talk about some of these things, and I talk about like healing from them and kind of personal development in the wake of them on my YouTube channel, on Twitter. It's there for anybody to see. So you can check out, my website, imaginal-cell.org. Maybe we can put a link. You can check out all the things I'm working on there. So yeah, just thank you very much. It's just a great opportunity to be able to talk with you guys about these things.
Yeah. Well, anyone else have any last thoughts you want to make, or? Okay.
I just want to say it's kind of refreshing when adults like you are like still trying to speak out about this stuff, because oftentimes what I see is, the people that I went to school with, that they complained about the stuff that happened to them, and then when they become adults themselves, they just totally flip position and they just start hating on young people doing the same stuff they used to oppose. So thank you for not doing that, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, yeah,
Thank you. That's a great compliment.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for coming on, talking. You seem really knowledgeable. You seem like you know a lot. I'm agreeing with pretty much everything you're saying. So yeah, definitely. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think that's it. Goodbye, everyone. Make sure to check us out on our YouTube channel. Make sure to check us out on our Spotify, our Twitter, the National Youth Rights Association. If you want to volunteer, you can send us an email at naira@youthrights.org. And yeah, see you in the next episode.